Good morning and a very warm welcome to this first EPC update of the new year, our regular look at developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, CEO and Chief Economist at the EPC, Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies. I'm delighted to welcome our special guest today. She's back, Almut Möller, Director for European and Global Affairs and Head of the Europe in the World Programme at the EPC. As always, totally interactive conversation. I have some questions for our panel. If you have any questions, either put them in the Q&A box in writing or click on the raised hands button and I will come out to you and allow you to talk. Please, in either case, keep your questions as brief as possible. We have an enormous ground to cover today as we discuss Europe in 2026, the need for strategic choices. Let us dive straight in. And Almut, as our guest today, let me start with you. I just referred there to the title of this episode of Update, the need for strategic choices. Why do you believe that 2026 is a year when we face some profound choices? Or if I could put it another way, why can't it just be more business as usual?
One thing that makes it very clear to me, Jackie, is that we've confronted a very serious security threat in Europe for many years now, Russia's war of aggression. And we have a lack of clarity over security institutions and structures on the continent now, which the past year, months, and weeks and days have actually shown. And so Europeans need to think about very deeply where, with all the peddling they do right now, to make sure that there is a meaningful path towards peace in Ukraine that is acceptable for Ukraine in the first place and for Europeans, and trying to get a foot in the door, to think more widely about a landing pad for Europe's emancipation. And this is not a decision against anybody, against institutions that have existed and continue to exist, NATO as a guarantee for European security, or a decision against partners. It's profoundly a decision for Europe and a renewed choice towards European collaboration and the very essence of collaboration and integration. And so for me, then the second question related to this is, what role is there for the European Union in such a renewed sort of landscape of institutional collaboration in Europe that has to stretch beyond security, that of course has to look at Europe's future prosperity. And for me, this is not something I would demarcate with the beginning of 2026, but it has probably not been felt more acutely than at the beginning of this year.
So very profound, very fundamental questions that will need to be addressed. Fabian, from your perspective, why is it a year of strategic choices? And what do you see as the big questions that need to be answered this year?
Starting with what you already mentioned, is it business as usual? Well, I don't think the world will allow us to do business as usual. The world is very much continuing to change, and not in a way which is helpful for Europe or for the European Union. I think having seen a year which has started with Venezuela, which has gone on with Greenland, and that's just within the first 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks of the new year. I think it tells us what the world is going to look like. It's not going to get easier. And we are now at the point where we have to make choices. We will not be able to address everything. We are not able to do everything at the same time. So we have to make clear what is most important for Europe at this moment in time, and what are we going to invest in for the future, and how are we going to collectively react to what is happening, not least since something like Greenland, and I'm sure we'll come back to it, but this is very much a test of European credibility. If another country can simply come and take part of the territory, and we have no way of resisting that, then I think it tells us a lot about what choices we won't have in future.
Indeed, and we will come back to all of those issues specifically in a moment, but just to continue to paint the picture of the year ahead and the challenges you see it. Janis, would you echo what we've heard? Is there anything you would add in terms of the choices that we are facing?
Well, I can echo what has been said, but let me start by looking also backwards because I think that is important when we look towards the future. For a long time, we should not have been operating on the assumption that it is business as usual. And at least until 2022, Ukraine, we should have acknowledged that there is a massive change happening in front of our eyes. And with the election of Donald Trump, we should have realized that much more is coming than some people were ready to acknowledge. So that I think has led to a lack of ambition over the past, to trying to not go and accept the trade-offs that are needed, the costs of actions. And now I think it is becoming even more evident now looking forward that business as usual has not been a model and cannot be a model. And that has mostly to do with the role of the US, the way in which the Trump administration is operating, the consequences that it has for us, the consequences it has for transatlantic relations, but also the consequences it has for the relationship with other global partners and rivals. And it's not only undermining the rule-based rule of law order in many ways, and I think we should take Donald Trump serious, and also the parts in the national security strategy related to Europe, we should need to take him serious. It's about regime change, and it's about regime change in other parts of the Western Hemisphere, as they argue. And by the way, it's also about the EU, and it's about changing the politics in the European Union, in the member states, undermining the European Union, and hollowing it out. So what I think we have in front of us are a lot of known unknowns. But there will also be some unknown unknowns in front of us. And I think there is time to buckle up even further than we've done over the past years.
Just to follow up on that, Janis, you three co-authored a paper last week where you talk, let's focus on Venezuela first, then we'll come to Greenland, and then I'd like to talk also about developments in Ukraine, and then we'll broaden out. But you, in the paper that you published last week, you called Venezuela, quote, a symptom of a new world disorder and a deeper shift towards what you call interventionist isolationism. What is your assessment? What do you mean, first of all, by interventionist isolationism? And what is your assessment of the way the EU has responded to those developments? Janis first this time.
I would add to the interventionist isolationism also that we do not forget that this is following a revisionist agenda. It's not about keeping things as they are, but about massively changing the order of things. And by the way, we all seem to assume, and rightly assume, that that's something which the Trump administration is doing because it is finding itself in a position of strength in global affairs. But at the same time, it is coming out of actually, it's a sign of weakness of the Trump administration. It feels as if when you compare to past presidencies, it feels like the final stretches of a second presidency, where a president becomes a lame duck and is concentrating on things outside of the US, because this is where she thinks that it's something where you can actually operate. So we are in a massive change, and we see that now in the case of Venezuela. And we also, and I know we're going to talk about Greenland, as you already indicated, and it showcases it there. It also showcases it potentially with Iran, which is another thing which is now on our agenda. So the way in which the US is operating is massively affecting us. It's affecting global order, and it's not something that will end rather soon. But probably we should expect that it will become worse. That he will try to intervene. That he will try to go for a regime change in different parts of the world. And by the way, not regime turns towards democracy, but maybe towards autocratic system, which they believe, because of their position of strength in the so-called Western Hemisphere, they will be able to control better. Look at how they have opted to deal with Venezuela now.
Yeah. Fabian, in terms of the way the EU has responded to all of this, again, constantly it seems trying to balance any criticism that they have of Donald Trump with that concern perpetually over Ukraine and trying to keep Donald Trump on side over Ukraine. Have they got that balance right? since the developments in Venezuela, in broadly saying the international rule of law must be respected, but not then saying the second half of the sentence, which is we think it has been or we think it hasn't been. What assessment of the response?
Well, I think firstly, it's important to say there are different sources of disunity within the European Union, some of which also have to do with ideological differences, but they also have to do with hope. They have to do with some people believing that in some way this is positive for democracy. So they see it maybe as something which is to be welcomed, even though some of the elements of it are not in line with international law. I think there is a lot of difference in approaches, but yes, there is that underlying fear about what happens if we lose the support of the US. Not only in relation to Ukraine, but also in relation more generally in our global standing in our domestic politics. But the reality, I think, is becoming more and more obvious. We've seen it with the national security strategy. We've seen it ever since the Vance speech. There is a theme which runs through this administration's actions, which is that they see Europe, and particular liberal, multilateral, democratic Europe, as the enemy. They don't see us as allies. They don't see us as cooperating on issues. And when it comes to issues such as Ukraine, such as the opposition to Russia, more and more it is our business to deal with that. And I think we have to also be more outspoken when it comes to the principles. Because if these principles are not upheld, it will just invite the US administration to go a further step. And that's precisely what we've seen with Greenland. And are we going to react in the same way to Greenland as we reacted to Venezuela? If that is the case, then it looks very bleak
Let me
for
come back
Europe in
on
2026.
Greenland in a moment. And you say there the US regarding the EU as the enemy. Philip de Book in our audience saying, are the United States still our ally, or are they now to be considered by us as a rival, if not an enemy? Almut, your assessment of the response, and I'll come back to you, Janis, in a moment, but your assessment of the response to the developments in Venezuela, and would you echo Fabian in saying, actually, it's not working, in a sense, if I don't misinterpret you, Fabian, it's not really working trying to keep him on side. We need to be more robust when fundamental principles are at stake. What do you think?
Yeah, Jacki, you put it in a great way by asking or looking at it in terms of a question of balance. Have Europeans found the right balance? And I would say in some, no. And why is that? Of course, in this moment of vulnerability, where the main security priority has been for Europeans, minus some very few, to help a better outcome with regard to Ukraine. That is the major focus. And in this vulnerability and dependency on US support in this context, of course, it's very difficult to sort of craft language that would at least no further increase risk from the side of Europe to sort of make the US think, well, we're actually not going to invest more into that. Whether the US itself decides from one day to the next to do this differently is another question. But there is some, of course, important argument to say we need to keep engaged and we need to make sure that those channels of communication are working and are not jeopardized because we're just too vulnerable. But my point is that it is possible to open up a second arena of communication, and that is very much needed. And that is not one, as I said earlier on, against the US or against NATO as an institution that has question marks now, but that is one that says we are responding to a growing sense of discomfort in our electorates over our relationship with the United States. And that, I think, can be done independently in a way of, proactive communication about Europeans thinking about how they can do what they should have done a lot earlier, as Janis and Fabian have been pointing out, in crafting, an institutional environment, a political environment, an environment of coalitions over, taking their own destiny into their hands. And where you see that the electoral sort of push and pressure becomes more immediate, no least of course, in Denmark, where a prime minister, one of the staunchest allies of the United States and within NATO for many decades, actually, has been very clear and articulate because a very national interest of Denmark is at stake. That is, of course, also interacting with what citizens in the country feel is the responsibility of our governments in Europe to make sure that we are safe. And this is, I think, a dangerous environment almost to navigate. If Europeans are responding to this with further, almost deafening silence, as I see it and I've put it, this, I think, risks further erosion of support to European collaboration by institutions, and that includes the European Union. Citizens across Europe are asking themselves, how on earth is this all possible? They said to us they were working for us, and we are strong together, and we seem to be weak, exposed, vulnerable, ridiculed. And this is not what people in their, nothing to do with EU politics, is something that people, I think, start to profoundly feel is wrong.
Thank you. And indeed, to that point about the EU taking its destiny in its own hands, Fabian, you, in a to the point linked to this issue of Venezuela, said Europe is not weak because it lacks resources, power, or influence, but because it struggles to use them. And you called this a self-inflicted weakness. Let us turn to that in terms of the response on Greenland. We hear mounting rhetoric about Greenland. We have the president repeatedly refusing to rule out military action to take control of Greenland. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, is meeting Danish officials this week. We are seeing the EU speaking out more, individual member states as well, speaking out much more strongly on this. But how should the EU be preparing? What does it need to do? Does it need to continually try to focus on cooperation? For example, a proposal for a joint NATO mission on Arctic security to show we all take security seriously. Mr. Trump, you do not need to do this. Or is it confrontation inevitable? How should it prepare?
I think the starting point has to be that we take it very seriously. There are still a number of people who downplay the risk, who start with, well, yes, he says that, but in the end, he's not going to do it. It's not in the interest of the US. We have to be clear that this is a realistic possibility. And that in the end, this is also something we should have seen coming. It was on the agenda before. It was always clear that the mindset in the White House now is about essentially building empires. It's about what you dominate, and Greenland was clearly part of that for the Trump administration from the beginning. How do we react now? It is very difficult to do anything which will decisively stop Trump, because in many ways there are significant powers within the Trump administration when it comes to this issue. Certainly, if he chooses to intervene militarily, I do not see that any European country would resist in military form. But I think what we have to do is we have to raise the cost of any intervention. And that is also about making clear that there would be consequences. And in particular, that there would be economic consequences. And I would argue that these really need to be aimed at hurting where it hurts most, which is the political base of Donald Trump. If this has an impact on his prospects in the midterms, because there are jobs lost, because there is that economic impact, then I think it could well have a mitigating effect on what he might do.
So interesting, the threats the European Parliament is making, MEPs are making, saying we will block implementation of the EU-US trade deal, for example, if he doesn't stop making these threats. That's the sort of area you would focus on, the economic impact.
Well, I think it's the tool we have. We do have some economic power still. But I would go further than that. I would also look at what can we do, for example, in terms of the dollar. One of the biggest issues for Trump at this moment in time is inflation. This really hurts him with the electorate in the US itself. So if we can do anything to ensure that he pays the price for these illiterate economic policies, even more so, then that's something which has a political effect.
So interesting there, Janis. Fabian putting the emphasis on economic tools. I mentioned also one of the strategies the EU seems to be pursuing is to say, look, you don't need to do this. Security cooperation is the way. We'll acknowledge the threat, but have a joint NATO mission on to show how serious we are about this. Would you say could that work, or and does it need to be done anyway, whether it works or not, alongside using other tools? How do you assess the preparations for a response to what increasingly, as you say, doesn't look like idle speculation, but almost an inevitability? But maybe we're reading him wrong again.
Okay, this is not easy. We will definitely have to do what we're doing, try to indicate that there's a way to find a solution also to the interests which at least have been rhetorically mentioned of why Greenland is so important, and also use NATO in this context. And what the French, the Germans are having now in mind to do moves in this direction. But I think we need to go a step back. If you want to react to someone who has a clear definition of us versus them, because earlier we were asked, is he our ally? Is he, or is he potentially an enemy or a rival of us? We need to define of who the us is. And I think, and sorry for making this step back, you need to look of how he defines and how the Trump administration defines its enemies within the US itself. Anyone who is not with them, who is against them, they consider as being an enemy within. And you see that in the action of Trump and the US administration in the US itself. So the definition of us versus them from their side is that we, as pro-European liberal democratic forces, are clearly enemies, are clearly rivals. The way he operates also at home, he operates outside with respect to us versus them. You're not with us, you're against us, and then we're going to fight you. We're going to make sure that you have less influence. We're going to push politics in the direction of your political enemies within the EU also becoming stronger. If you understand that logic, I think that you can much better understand what they have in mind, and that is then important when it comes to how do you react. So when Fabian is saying, exactly. So if Fabian is saying you also need to weaken him at home, that's the way I'm putting it, plays into this, which means you need to strengthen those forces who are closer to us, who have a different understanding of certain principles, who also oppose the way he's operating in Venezuela and in other places of the world today and tomorrow, because we, as I said earlier, we need to buckle up for more of these things happening in future. So that means we need to, wherever he is potentially can be weakened in the US itself, we need to say what role we can play. That has to do with the economics, because something he's very weak is the economic situation, is inflation, is the affordability crisis, is the housing situation, and you can go on. There are certain elements where he and potentially also his supporters, the MAGA, the Make America Great Again group, are in confrontation among themselves and maybe even with him. We need to think much more political in how we react. So we need to do the traditional reaction to how we consider homework to be done and how we have done our homework in the past when we have encountered similar situation, which we need to do. But I think we need to think beyond it. And the last point, if he really wants to destroy the EU, meaning to structurally not only undermine their unity, but raise this unity among Europeans, Greenland's potentially in their head, Greenland potentially might be the key to get there. So if that is a real assumption, if that's what they want, if that's an objective, and if you read the national security strategy, that's what they want. They want to get rid of the EU as we know it. And they want to support those who are ready to support that cause. If they want to do it, Greenland can be the way to get there. That's why this is so dangerous, also from a European integration perspective.
Thank you very much. Almut, your thoughts here, and a question from Joe Linen saying, why not trigger Article 42.7, namely the mutual defence clause of the treaties, the EU treaties, to help Denmark and to protect Greenland? What do you think the EU should be doing, and are we at that phase, do you think, of potentially triggering that article?
It's too risky to trigger that article. In this environment, you have to be able to deliver. If you want to be strong, you're navigating a malign environment, and the political consideration at this point in time, be at any point in time, that bluffs are going to be called, in particular when it comes to security and defense. And so, as much as I wish for the Union to be united and be able to play, and let's face it, well beyond the security and defense perspective, this is essentially a political question. So the Union, for me, should play a big role in this. So I'm not saying Article 42.7 is irrelevant. Quite the contrary. I wish it was more relevant. But at this point in time, the situation is not that it would be a credible alignment. But at the same time, I think it's very important, and that relates to what I said earlier on, you don't have to work against something, you have to work for something, is to make sure that, and I assume this is happening behind the scenes very much as a kind of not center stage activity, but behind the scenes activity, that relevant European governments are coordinating a response and making sure that should it come to a situation in which even the use of military force is not excluded, there is a united, if only, almost united response by the European Union and its member states, because coalitions of the willing, of course, are meaningful. But at this point in time, I think the currency, the hard currency of really demonstrating with larger numbers that Europe is united is a very important one. And so it might not be about articles that can be referred to or pulled. It might be more about this sort of consensus building for the very moment that Janis portrays as a very dangerous one, and I agree with him. If Europe was exposed, if the European Union was exposed with disunity and lack of unity and surprise of any kind in a scenario in which their core interests are being much more attacked than it has been the case for now, then this will be literally the end of the very idea of European collaboration. I'm not even saying about the European Union. And so this is something that I assume is happening behind the scenes, and it is much needed because domestically it is required. And that is, I believe, something that the European Union also and its members need to look at in the broader perspective. If you compare 2025, 2026 with 1989, it's that kind of almost empty canvas situation in which there needs to be a political response to the developments of the past year or so over future order on the European continent. Without that, Europe will not be able to have any impact on the global turbulence and chaos that is happening. And that also relates to, of course, the very important issues that Fabian is talking about, getting our house in order in terms of, our own economic security.
I want to come back on that issue in a moment.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And of course, talking here about the Treaty on European Union and mutual defence clauses, this is, of course, and we'll come back later, I hope, to the future of NATO and what all this could mean, because, of course, there is also Article 5, the previously unthinkable idea that one NATO member might attack another NATO member, and what the EU should be doing to prepare for the potential collapse of NATO. We'll come back on that, Janis, because I want
No, I just want to mention Greece, Turkey.
Right. We'll come back on that.
Have this case.
Indeed, we do. We will come back on that a little bit later. In the meantime, I would like just to focus on a couple of other recent developments, namely, first of all, Ukraine. As we've been saying, many of the attempts on the more muted response on Venezuela, on sort of voices of calm over Greenland and so on, has been because of concern over Ukraine. We did see last week another meeting of the coalition of the willing in Paris. It seemed to be relatively positive in terms of developments on security guarantees, but I'm having a question in my mind about while we're focusing on those issues, do you really believe that we are any closer to some sort of peace deal in Ukraine. So how meaningful is this conversation about security guarantees and the degree to which the EU itself can remain united? We have some interesting conversations in the last week, for example, about whether we should reopen dialogue with Vladimir Putin. Emmanuel Macron and Giorgia Meloni suggesting that we should. We have this week the proposals, the detailed proposals on the loan to Ukraine, the 90 billion loan to Ukraine that was discussed before Christmas. A lot of things. Do you think, what's your assessment, Janis? Maybe start with you in terms of the outcome of that meeting and more broadly, the chances of the EU. I think we always have to say on this one, minus Hungary, because they won't sign up to any conclusions on Ukraine, sticking together on this and continuing to support Ukraine in the way that's needed. Janis.
Yes. Well, first of all, and I start with that, minus Hungary and also other forces within the EU have a different position. So let's not forget that. Plus those who are actually have similar interests. This is why we're talking about, and we're having that coalition of the willing, which obviously does not only include EU countries, and that is very important because, as I said earlier, the definition of us is something which we really need to be aware of when we speak about how we react to these situations. Now, obviously, it is extremely important, and it was important that a step was made with respect to security guarantees or future security guarantees for Ukraine, which, by the way, still have to be developed in detail. Also, if you witnessed the reaction of the German Chancellor when he was asked about what actually it would mean that Germany would contribute, he was saying, well, first of all, we need to see what kind of peace deal will be achieved before we can answer what concretely Germany should be doing. And this is just one example. So what exactly is meant when we talk about security guarantees still has to be spelled out. The question is whether actually Vladimir Putin has an interest to come to a conclusion of the so-called peace plan, and also how Trump will be dealing with it within the upcoming days, weeks, months, which can massively change. And I think the fact of how we are discussing things today shows how all these elements are linked with each other: the Venezuela, Greenland, Ukraine, Iran, and what else might come on the table if he continues along the path of the one he has now embarked in, as a sign of his presidential weakness, not a sign of his presidential strength. So there was the right thing to do because Europeans need to showcase that they're ready to provide security guarantees. But there are a lot of open questions, a lot of issues that still need to be settled, and especially whether Putin wants to actually come to a plan. And by the way, and I assume we're also going to reflect on that, the Ukrainians are also pushing with respect to EU enlargement or accession to the EU when it comes to the peace plan. So they're also pushing for a direction which Europeans have a lot they could on their own decide on how they and what they want to do. And I say Europeans while having in mind that, again, on this issue, you have Hungary opposing and also many others who are opposed to Ukraine's accession. So you see how all these things interrelate with each other, and that makes it even more difficult.
Indeed. Fabian?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing at this moment in time is a large degree of uncertainty about the near future. But what we should keep in mind is, and this is why we also have this link, what we have seen in Venezuela is this belief that essentially you divide up the world into different empires. And unfortunately, when we look at where that Russian empire is going to be, it clashes directly with our immediate security, and it certainly clashes with the existence of Ukraine. So we should not be relying on the US in guiding us in the right direction. So we need to do whatever we can at this moment in time. The loan, which we just agreed, was a beginning, and we still have to figure out what it actually means. But there's a lot more we have to do also in terms of building up our own capabilities, investing into resilience, into defense and security. And we need to also think about what is it we can actually put on the table. And there, Janis is absolutely right. We have the enlargement question. And yes, there will be opposition to that from within. Hungary is a guarantee that it will be opposition, but there will be others as well. But that shouldn't stop us from going ahead and putting concrete offers on the table, which also address the question of how do we deal with that then within our own systems, within the reforms which are needed to get there. And I think it's important to note that we have this discussion at this moment in time. At the same time, we're discussing the next MFF, and there's nothing in there about Ukraine as a member or about enlargement. That, for me, doesn't go together. You have to be far more consistent.
So we're not seeing any encouraging signs that the EU is accepting what it needs to do to prepare for enlargement, not only to Ukraine, but also to the other countries waiting to join. Almut, your assessment of where we are and the importance of those security guarantees, even if that peace deal, I mean, peace seems to mean to Donald Trump, and you've pointed it out, all of you, in some of the papers you've written, peace is achieving an absence of fighting through dominance. I win. Someone wins. And that's how we get peace. And then he asked for the Nobel Peace Prize. Fascinating, really. But in terms of the importance of having those security guarantees and at least keeping the US nominally on side, important, not important at this stage because a real peace deal is so elusive. And your assessment of the EU and its capacity to stick together on this with the caveats that Janis has mentioned.
Yeah, not that we're implying, but just to say, of course, the aggressor is very clear here. It's Vladimir Putin. And, Donald Trump has been creating a lot of grief for Europeans, but he has been guaranteeing for Ukraine and Europe to be able to collectively hang in for many years now. I think that's important, because it also explains why Europeans have been doing the dance and have tried to sort of mobilize transatlantic resources in different and new ways, etc. And that's all fair. Having said that, very importantly so, we have a coalition of the willing that is led by an EU and a non-EU European country that goes well beyond European countries. This is one of the really better news of 2025. There is political will and investment, and then there is movement regarding playing a strong role in an environment in which we can think of, security guarantees that are needed. And the Germans, just quickly referring to Janis, I mean, yes, Matt should have been more bold and clearer and not miss the train last week. But at the same time, Germany won't be a major stumbling block in my assessment. I mean, he's kind of giving a calibrated and careful response at a given point in time, but the German environment, including the German domestic environment, is not impeding Germany from playing a strong role. So this is all good news. Of course, what we need is, as you say, Jacki, that Vladimir Putin wants to get anywhere close to something that is a negotiated settlement and a path towards peace in Ukraine. And he doesn't want that. And so the question is, and this has been something that Europeans and Americans alike have been working on for years, and Europeans have quite failed to some extent to raise the cost for Vladimir Putin to hang in with this war of aggression. And so now we have a situation in which the trust, and here the transatlantic perspective comes in, who is speaking to whom? Rightly so, Europeans have said there is nothing that we can talk to Vladimir Putin about in a given environment where he does not stop the aggression. And, we accept the interlocutors that the United States have been. But there have been European voices now saying, well, let's move beyond that. And that, for me, is a sign of two things. The first one is we are investing in Europe with transatlantic partners serious capital in finding a negotiated path towards peace in Ukraine. And Russia has been getting away with a lot of, things, even though there is meaningful process in Europe and across the Atlantic. So to raise the cost for Putin to be able to do that by calling his bluff and by calling him out as the one who refuses to join any meaningful non-military solution to his war of aggression. That is one interpretation of why we have European leaders addressing the question over whom and when to talk to Vladimir Putin. But then, of course, there is also an element as to, who is it we can trust when we talk over the future of European security. And for me, I welcome signs in European capitals that say, this is vested interest. We are taking our destiny into our own hands. It's not that we abandon partnerships. We are actually building also, and we should be building partnerships anew. And, we are at the same time not at the receiving end of what is being discussed in other capitals. Whether that will lead to any results is an open question, but to take that risk to fail, I think, is more important than ever. And this is, how I interpret the issue that you've raised with European capitals taking a stronger stance on, let's get him to the negotiate, or let's talk, not negotiate, but let's talk.
Okay. I don't know whether either of you, Fabian, Janis, want to react on that. And if someone also on the issue of Iran, we now see Kaja Kallas is preparing, the High Representative, preparing for the possibility of fresh sanctions on Iran following the crackdown that has killed hundreds of protesters. How should the EU respond? And again, do we look here as if we're always the ones playing catch up? That the EU really doesn't have a voice and won't be listened to. What is your assessment, Fabian, perhaps, of what is happening in Iran and the EU's preparations to respond?
Well, we talked about Iran in previous updates already, noting that when we had the attacks on the nuclear facilities, that actually Europe was already rather sidelined in this. I think it is right that we are now talking about sanctions, talking about consequences, but what the European Union is going to do in this is not going to determine an outcome, neither on the ground in Iran, nor is it going to influence what Trump might decide to do or not to do.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, and we should make it clear that any opposition to the kind of interventionist logic we have seen from the US does not mean we are endorsing a regime which is clearly killing its own people, which is clearly hanging on in an illegitimate way. In the same way, also, we wouldn't have supported the Maduro regime. But we just need to make it clear that that does not mean we should break international law, that we should break the kind of principles which we need to apply in all the conflicts, because it also, and that's referring back to the previous topic, it also undermines what we've been arguing with Ukraine for a very long time. That's precisely about upholding these kind of principles.
Indeed. Janis, did you want to add something there?
I think, well, I'm not a specialist on Iran. But having said that, what we're seeing happening on the ground seems to be of a nature which is much more substantial when it comes to opposition to the regime, to the Mullah regime. So what is actually happening seems to be something which potentially could lead to major developments within Iran. The question is, what can we do in order to support those who are supporting an agenda of change within the country? And there, I think there is still a big question mark as to whether what is being discussed in the U.S. or the different options which seem to be discussed within the U.S. Or by the U.S. administration, there are big question marks as to whether they will help actually people who want to change the destiny of their own country, or whether it's helping actually the Mullah regime to argue, look, this is outside interference. Everything of this is being orchestrated by the U.S. They want to weaken Iran. So they're using this in favor of the argument. So we need to be careful of how we react to what potentially the U.S. will be doing and how we then position ourselves. And I think that is the filter, how we need to see it through. How can we help those who actually want to have a fundamental change and democratic change within Iran?
Jacki, one general point and one specific point on Iran. I think what we're going to see is, of course, partly because of the change in US foreign and security policies, a lot of change across the globe. This has direct and indirect consequences. Other players are observing what is happening. They draw their own conclusions. They become more testing. They're doing things they would have not done in the past, et cetera, et cetera. So Europe collectively, even in the context of the EU, will be confronted with a lot of change, fast-paced, sometimes closer to home, sometimes more distant, sometimes more of a direct impact on a faster erosion of the global order than we would have wished for, because it was friendlier to us than the situation is now. Sometimes it will happen, a little bit more manageable. So I think it's important also from an analytical perspective to look at priorities. And this is not meant in a cynical way. Of course, Fabian said all that is needed to say at this point in time regarding the struggle of those that have been suppressed in Iran for way too long. But we need to be also realistic about the means the European Union has collectively. And here, clearly for me, is making it more difficult for the Iranian regime to rely on its apparatus of domination and of violence. And, we have had these discussions over sanctioning, including the Revolutionary Guards in the past. And, there are ways that Europeans can actually help sort of impede or sort of hurt and harm the power of this machinery. And it should be done. Having said that, there is at some point also the need to acknowledge that at this point in time, Europe's priorities are clearly on its own turf. This is what I believe. And here, I think we will see less of Europe collectively in Iran, certainly not compared to the role that Europe played in the past with regard to negotiations with Iran.
This links very much back to something Fabian said at the beginning about there are choices. We need to prioritize. We need to make those strategic choices. I want to come back on the issue of economic security. And we talked of it in the context of, as Fabian put it earlier, hitting the US where it hurts, hitting its base where it hurts. But in broader terms, Dominic Fisher in our audience says apparently reducing dependencies is key. In which domains can Europe obtain technological sovereignty? What should we focus on, and which political frameworks are required to achieve this? I mean, Fabian, we are now in a debate. The EU still likes to talk about open trade, openness. How can the EU reconcile this continued, at least lip service to openness, a question mark, is it now lip service really, and forge a shared approach to dealing with our strategic dependencies? Where do you see this debate going now against the backdrop of all these issues we've been discussing?
Unfortunately, the EU, the traditional liberal democracy, cannot reconcile because what we are facing at this moment in time is a world where security, including economic security, has to play a much bigger role. And that implies that there will be a cost to pay. This is not going to come for free. It is not going to be the world in which, by and large, Europe has benefited very much from an open environment, but an open environment which still had a certain level of rules which were there. We are now in an environment where these rules are becoming, if not optional, but they certainly are much weaker, and there will be a much greater temptation, not only by the US, but also by others, to not follow the rules when it doesn't suit them anymore. And Europe will have to react to that. In some areas, that means actually greater openness. We need to open much more when it comes to partnerships, when we want to have access to resources in other places. That's not going to happen automatically. But in other areas, it also means that we have to close down the hatches much more. What we cannot do is produce everything within the EU. That's just not possible. So we are still going to be dependent on the global environment. But we have to find ways of navigating that better. And for me, one of the crucial things which we have seen in the Ukraine example, we also need to see in the economic field, which is these coalitions of the willing who are wanting to work together. And if we work together on economic security, then we can also afford to be more open with each other. But that very much depends on working with countries which share the same principles when it comes to economic exchanges.
And Almut, perhaps, how do you see, in that context, the debate, the battle royal that was waged over the EU-Mercosur trade deal? Finally, we have an agreement last Friday, high cost, 45 billion more euro for farmers in the next EU budget to soften the blow. But of course, that was all about diversifying. That was all about if you like, trade partnerships as coalitions of the willing in this new era when globalization is so heavily challenged. How do you see this issue?
Very important. And of course, it was controversial. We know that and have known that in Europe over other free trade agreements as well. It took long, yes. There was a lot of discussion. There were concessions and compromise in the end, but it saw the light of day. And the European Union is geared up to do something similar with another big trading partner that has a lot of potential, that is India. And so for me, these are very important choices that are happening, that are domestically here and there contested. But my sense is that the geopolitical and geoeconomic environment is understood to the extent that, by and large, European governments feel it is worth going beyond the need for unity at this point in time, which is, a lesson that we've learned last year. And so something similar, I believe, Europeans need to energetically do now on the front of, the mode of international collaboration. Because what we've been talking about, this might makes right, survival of the fittest, you grab, a bit like a den in which you drag, your prey after you've succeeded. This is a mode that is not attractive to many countries in the world because they are far less powerful than the European Union and its member states. And so to energetically invest into coalitions that actually probably build on the coalition of the willing, remind us of the relevance of international law, that remind us of the need to work together ultimately with not always converging interests, but ultimately with the spirit of wanting to get to the table with one another, accept negotiations, etc. Here is a lot of scope and potential. And this is more a diplomatic side of things, which to me is really an important lesson also to learn from last year. This is not all about European security and defense. We spent a lot of discussions, and there is going to be a lot more money spent on security and defense, strictly speaking, which is needed in Europe, very much needed. But responses need to be beyond that. They need to be political. And here, I think Europeans collectively, both with the EU structures, but also with what national capitals have on offer, has to be out in the world to build those relationships a lot more energetically than in the past.
I want to broaden this out, Janis, now, if I might, in terms of pull all these issues together and all these developments together and really talk about the challenges for European integration, for EU institutions, but also the challenges we've touched on, the challenge to NATO, particularly as a result of the threats to Greenland, the challenges to the United Nations, which has been becoming increasingly irrelevant, seemingly. Does it have a role anymore in this world of great powers that believe they're entitled to behave as they like in their own neighborhoods? I wonder, first, let's taking the EU. Do you think the sort of structural disagreements that we've seen, and you pointed it out earlier when we were talking about Ukraine, it's not just Hungary, it's other countries as well, but those structural disagreements among the EU27 on many of the issues we've talked about, are they set to become a lasting feature of our politics, or can a way be found to bridge them? If it can't, you've talked a lot about coalitions of the willing, I always get this wrong, supragovernmental avant-gardes, different ways to work together. Is that the only way forward, or can we bridge these disagreements? Janis first.
Well, first of all, the machinery of the EU is always trying to bridge these differences and try to find a consensus, but we increasingly see that it's becoming more difficult to find the consensus. This is why also in 2025, we saw that there were increasingly conclusions by the President of the European Council, conclusions which did not include all member states. So I think this is something which we already have been witnessing, and I think it will become even stronger. My assumption would be that also the US administration will do its best to have these differences among Europeans become stronger, and they will also test us. And I was referring to that potential test when it comes to Greenland. So a big question mark is, what do pro-European liberal forces do to counter that? How far are they ready to go? Are they actually trying to implement some of the things which they say in Sunday speeches when they talk about European integration as a necessity and also as a need to deepen European integration and collaboration. And if this is not able to be done within the framework of the European Union, potentially to be done outside the European Union, or even for those who pro-European forces to agree on what they will do among themselves in the spirit of European integration, the spirit of the European Union. That means it will be a big test for the European Union, for European integration. Don't understand me wrongly. I'm not saying this, or we're not arguing in favor of OSCA, open supra-governmental avant-garde, because this is the best of options, but we argue in favor of this because we believe if pro-European liberal forces want to actually solve some of the problems they're facing, they need to do it among themselves. Also, if it's not doable within the EU framework, or they need to do it among themselves before it reaches the EU level, which potentially is something we might see further in the future and maybe even institutionalized. But having said all that, the question is whether we have, and the pro-European forces, and I'm trying to be positive towards the future, have the power and the stamina to actually get their act together. We're being very critical of those who are not allowing for consensus to be found, or for not having an ambition which is strong enough. But we need to be very critical of those forces within the European Union who are pro-European, who actually are not getting their act together. That means we need to be critical of ourselves, if you define us as the pro-European liberal forces. And that's something which we really struggle with. And as long as we struggle with, this is going to be a severe structural weakness of the European Union, of European integration. And those who want to undermine us will use that in order to further structurally weaken the way in which Europeans are able to operate. So if we don't understand that logic, I fear that we will be continuously falling into the same traps. And at times, some of these traps might be as big that the old crisis automatism, which people were advocating, meaning that if there's a severe fundamental crisis, we always have been able to get our act together and progress with respect to European integration. That old normative approach to European integration, I would say, which empirically was founded in the past, might no longer work in future. And that is really risky and dangerous.
Want to stay on this. I'll come back on NATO and the United Nations later, but link this also to a question from Philippe Hammer-Drutz in our audience saying the EU has for a long time been above all reactive concerning global challenges, much due to internal heterogeneity, the issues on which the EU can find agreement. Would there exist, asked Philippe, any political topics where the EU could be proactive? On which topics, if any? I throw that into the mix, but Fabian, from your perspective, we are doomed now to live with these structural disagreements forever and find the sort of ways around them that you have been suggesting, all three of you, in a number of papers over the last year or so, or ways can be found particularly by focusing on certain topics, perhaps? Question.
Well, I think we have to live with the reality, and the reality is that the politics in which we are operating is not one where we are going to have this kind of unity we have seen in the past. Or at least not to produce the kind of outcomes we need. This is coming back to my point about progress illusion, that the kind of challenges we are now facing in scale, in scope, in speed are so different from in the past that a small compromise which gets us forward is not helping us to catch up with where the world is going. So I think we live with that reality. We are not going to go back to a golden age where you can get agreement, where we will address the issues which are there. But are we really willing to take the risks? And this is what Janis has emphasized just now. The risk is very, very significant because it is about rethinking European integration. It is looking at institutions differently. It's looking at different constellations. We're not talking about, for example, the old idea of a core periphery where some countries are always going ahead first and then others are following. We're talking about something much more messy, much more difficult, much harder to manage. But if we don't do this, the big risk is we just simply fade into insignificance. First at the European level, where more and more things will then just simply be done at the national level, and then collectively, because while there are many challenges, we should also not forget that the European Union is the only thing which gives us the ability to pool resources, to pool sovereignty, to be able to speak at a level which no single country in Europe, no matter which
And
one, is
indeed,
able to do.
in an era of big power politics, even more crucial to be among those big powers by sticking together. Almut, a word to that, if you would, but also to this broader question of the threat to the future of NATO, the threat to the future of the United Nations. I've seen even suggestions that now we need to think about having a European Security Council alongside the UN Security Council because of that fear that the UN is sliding into complete irrelevance now. What is your sense of what needs to be done to prepare for this much more contested future and the crumbling, frankly, of an order that we spent the past century building? The post-World War II order no longer exists or is unraveling very quickly. How do we prepare for that?
How long have we got? I'm afraid a couple of minutes, Jacki. So I'll stick with European security and the role of NATO. Of course, no European leader wants to tear down NATO. But there are forces at play that have put into question whether NATO will be able to deliver on its promise. And if I was a European leader, in particular one that was more vulnerable or immediately vulnerable or felt more immediately vulnerable to what might be envisaged in Europe with regard to Russia's aggression and beyond, then, of course, I need to think well beyond NATO and think about what is, in terms of, not today or tomorrow, but what is the guarantee that at least I attempt to be making to fellow citizens? And my hunch would be to say, well, of course, we need to live with NATO as long as we have it, but at the same time, invest in something that is a genuinely European security order well beyond the long and often discussed European pillar of NATO. By the way, European countries, I think, have been smart in pooling resources, both from EU and also from non-EU, environments to deliver on the European pillar within NATO. But analytically and strategically, we need to think beyond that, and that needs to be prepared. And that is not an easy environment because the EU is not going to easily become, a replacement of NATO, no least because very, very important security providers in Europe are not members of the Union and are not getting anywhere remotely close to becoming members again, the United Kingdom in the first place. And so this is a complex discussion. And what I'm missing at this point in time, that Europeans are discussing it. And it is not something that has to happen in secret. I mean, it's blatantly obvious. And the Prime Minister of Denmark called into question the future of NATO. We're not undermining NATO any further by saying, we need to have a plan. And so my expectation is that European leaders, think tanks, and all that have stakes in this sit, fret, and think about under the difficulty of 2026, which is not 1989, when a benign partner on the other side of the Atlantic helped Europeans build a new institutional structure that is the EU and provided for a division of labor between the EU doing basically economic prosperity and NATO doing security. This no longer is the logic that we can rely on. What is next? And this is a process. And I'm not thinking about this as another constitutional moment for the European Union, and the likes of what we've seen in the past. It's going to be a lot more complex, it's going to be messy, it's going to be probably more a landscape of institutions that has to interact and integrate coalitions of the willing on the one hand, a smart link with institutions that we have established in Europe, and most importantly, the European Union, because we shouldn't jeopardize the fact that we have institutional cohesion to quite some extraordinary extent. It's always very difficult to rebuild institutions. And this is just, the European environment. And of course, you're right to say the post-World War II international Western style order is no longer. And there are a lot of powers in the world that are looking at this with expectations and excitement rather than with fear, trepidation, and, hesitance. And so we should be out in that space as well. But the most important work in terms of priorities that Europeans can do at this point in time is help develop the European piece to that, and then try to transcend it at the same time into making it a module in a way of a future global order. And this is at least the ambition that I would have from our European leaders. This is what our citizens expect. They expect answers well beyond, details of security and defense environments. They want the bigger picture.
Thank you. Fabian, you wanted to jump in, and also Janis on this point, and then we'll try and draw some conclusions from this conversation.
Yeah, just very briefly, but on the future of NATO, I think one of the crucial questions we have to ask ourselves is, do we believe that the security guarantees of NATO still hold? And do others, especially Moscow, believe they still hold? And if the answer to either of those is in any way questioning, then there's a lot we have to do. Because if we don't believe that these security guarantees are as firm as they have been in the past, it will invite further imperialistic action. So we have to be ready for that.
Janis.
Well, I think I'll start from the obvious, linking to what Fabian just said. Obviously, adversaries, including Vladimir Putin, will test Article 5. They want to see whether Article 5 actually is something which is credible or not. And I don't think that even the US administrations or those in the US administrations who might be most extreme want actually a collapse of NATO. What they want is that, to follow what I was saying earlier, that NATO partners will be with them, how they define them, and obey. Do what we want you to do. And as long as you are with us and you obey, it's fine. And we will guarantee that we will stick to NATO. We will also stick to Article 5. But you need to be ready to obey, to do what we want. And that is a fundamental dilemma we are now operating under.
How does
what Almut was saying was perfectly correct. That's what we should be doing. What I'm asking myself, and here is where I become really skeptical and fearful, is whether we will have the time to do so, or whether there will be pressures coming upon us where, and as I said earlier, Greenland might be the case, where we will be forced to give an answer. Are you ready to be with us and obey? If not, you really have a problem. And that, I think, is something we will be confronted with. And everything which Almut correctly said we should be doing, which, by the way, we should have been started to be doing a long time ago. And many security and defense specialists have been telling us should have, and we have also been discussing that in our updates, we should have acted much earlier than we're now are forced to act. And I fear that we will not be provided with the time to do so. Having said all that, going back to what we were saying earlier, there are substantial weaknesses of the Trump administrations at home. And that is important that we have that in mind. Plus, there are also big question marks among those who ideologically are close to Trump and Trumpism as to whether they should follow when it comes to issues like Venezuela, or potentially what they should do in the case the US administration decides to pull the trigger when it comes to Greenland in order to actually undermine the European integration and collaboration. So what will the AfDs and the Le Pens and so forth and the Kaczynskis do once they will be confronted with that situation?
This isn't such an easy question for them to answer as some of the others.
It's no easy answer. There is no easy answer for any of us.
Indeed not.
But luckily, Jacki and Janis, if I can have some shameless promotion of recent EPC material, there has been a lot of traffic on our Northern Europe platform looking at Greenland, the impact of the violation of international law on Europe. And, a big shout out to our partners and members who might also be participating in this seminar. So none of this is easy, as you were saying, but we're onto it as always, starting afresh into the year with a lot of new and good ideas and partnerships from across Europe.
Indeed. Okay, we are almost out of time, but I want to come back to something that you said, all of you, in the paper talking about inputs from the EPC on these very important issues, the paper that you co-authored last week. You said there is a clear lesson for Europe, and I'm quoting, "Unless it adapts and fights back, it risks losing the ability to defend European values and interests with lasting consequences for future generations." Janis was asking there, do we have the time to do what we need to do? For each of you, where does the fight back begin? What is the key next step the EU needs to take if it is to adapt and fight back? And I will go the other way round this time. I'm going to go Janis first, then Fabian, and I started with you, Almut, so I'll give you the last word. 1.5 minutes each. Janis, the key next step, where does the fight back begin?
It starts with those who actually have understood where we are finding ourselves and who are ready to go the extra mile, which is the pro-European liberal forces. This is where it needs to start. If they don't get their act together, we're not going to be able to manage the situation. It's going to become worse. And those who a year or 2 or 3 or 5 years ago were being called as being too pessimistic and who, with a brutal honesty, were displaying of where we are and potentially where we might be moving, have been proven correct. So and that is a very unfortunate, assume that negative scenarios will materialize, and let's not take any of and still some are, let's not take any of the things which we assume to be secure and which we could rely on to be secure and to be relied on in the future. We must challenge fundamental thinking. And unfortunately, this means, and this is what makes it politically so difficult, and which is a major difference to the reference to 1989, which we've made throughout the last 1 hour, it is about avoiding the worst. That means you need to have something in mind which you want to do, which actually is not something where you can promise and the situation will be better thereafter. That is politically extremely difficult. So it's about avoiding the waste, which is not avoiding the worst, which is not politically attractive. But I think that's the right thing and the right mindset we now need to have in mind. And that goes with our actions within Europe, but also beyond, and including in how we affect what's happening in the US. Was that 1.5 minutes?
Indeed, perfect. Fabian.
I don't think there's a single thing which will resolve this. So it is about also coherence, looking across different areas and making the connections. We cannot separate Venezuela from Greenland, from Ukraine. These are belonging together, and we have to look at them as a coherent whole. But what I think is crucial in all of this is that we have to start having different conversations with our populations, and we have to see that our leadership will also start to communicate that this is a difficult world. It is a world where we will make hard choices, because that is what we are being forced to do. But what we need to show much more, and I think this is about also using what the far right has been doing for a long time, we have to show people what is going to happen if we don't do these kind of things. So in other words, we have to make them afraid of the alternative future which we are facing unless we start to react differently.
Thank you very much, Almut. Final word to you.
First priority, make sure that Ukraine gets continued and greater support, to make it very clear, including militarily, to make it clear to Russia that it will not achieve its goal, declared goal of winning this war, because it won't. We have seen some encouraging signs that Europeans have understood that they have to do this regardless of what others are doing. Secondly, work towards the moment in which there will be the need to stand united beyond the coalition of those that have already stood in support of Greenland and Denmark's role in this. This needs to be a unified moment when it comes. If not, this will be completely damaging. So this is the second one. And the third one is something that can be very easily done. And that is a renewed choice for Europe. And with that, I don't mean necessarily the European Union. A lean declaration that says, in Europe, we have understood that we need to take yet again, in a complicated environment, our destiny into our own hands. And this is how we're going to go about it, inside the EU and well beyond that. And this as a sign of also hope and a sign of clear commitment of European leaders. This is something that Europeans, I believe, can be mobilized and rallied behind, because they felt rather that we have been silent on those bigger picture sort of declarations. And I don't mean that in an innocent way. You know, I've chosen moments in which I said, we really don't need another declaration of some sort if we cannot put any meaningful things behind that. We have a lot to put behind, European unity, and we should be doing it right now, calmly, as a choice for Europe.
Thank you very much. And many of those recommendations for how Europe needs to act to take its destiny into its own hands are explored in many of the publications that you've written. I would just draw your, Almut was referring to the work that's been done since the start of the year, responding to all of these developments. Just to flag up a few, I mentioned the paper co-authored by Fabian, Janis and Almut earlier, entitled Trump's Interventionist Isolationism, Venezuela as a Symptom of the New World Disorder. There was also an EU special analysis of the US action in Venezuela and the European response, with a series of commentaries on the implications. And in relation to Denmark, again, a number of publications, including one published today, a discussion paper entitled The Great Game of the Arctic, Denmark, Greenland and the US Empire. Do take a look at those. They're all on the EPC website. When it comes to events, a very busy agenda again. Later this afternoon, there will be a hybrid policy dialogue on Ukrainian resistance and transatlantic uncertainty, what to expect in 2026, with the Ukrainian ambassador to the EU and other speakers. Tomorrow, there'll be a policy dialogue hosted by an MEP, so it's in the European Parliament, on choking Kremlin's war machine, securing EU energy supply without Russia. On Wednesday, a conference on financing Europe's future, how to mobilize more strategic investment. Many, many more publications, many, many more events. Do take a look at the website. We will be back next month with another update. In the meantime, thank you very much, and particularly to you, Almut, for joining us today. Great to have you back with us. Fabian, Janis, as always, but most of all, to all of you for joining us and for your questions to our panel. Thank you very much indeed, and see you next time.